Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Julia Boorstin. I will tell you all about Julia in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment, the compassion we exert toward others. And when you do it from a leadership position, you do it to bring people together for common cause. Julia Boorstin, welcome to Grace Under Pressure.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, I want to tell folks all about you. Julia is CNBC's senior tech and media correspondent. She's been an on-air reporter since 2006. She has played a central role in CNBC's broadcast on her program, Tech Check. She has also created a CNBC Disruptor 50, an annual list that oversees, highlights private companies transforming the economy and changing the world for the better. She also helped launch a program called Closing the Gap. She's a graduate of Princeton and been a contributor to Fortune magazine, and she has a brand new book out, When Women Lead, and that is why you are here today, Julia. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I'm so excited to talk about my book and to connect with your audience.
Well, great. Julia, why is it so important that women leaders all over the world focus on who they are, that is, their characteristics, to become more effective as leaders?
Well, here's the thing. Female leaders are vastly underrepresented. If you look at the Fortune 500, just about 8.5% of those CEOs are women, and that's an all-time high. And then if you look at the venture capital space, the realm of entrepreneurship, over the past decade or so, female founders have drawn just 3% of all venture capital dollars, which is remarkable, just tiny. And then if you look at 2021, that actually dropped to 2%. So on one hand, women are not getting access to capital, are not holding the most powerful leadership roles. But on the other hand, if you look at the success of women in business, when women do hold those leadership roles, companies tend to outperform. When women do get access to capital, those women tend to have more profitable exits, earlier exits for their investors. So I was really struck by the fact that when women have defied the odds, their leadership skills and strategies really have made them exceptional and offer a lot for everyone to learn from. So I think that we should have more women in leadership positions because all the data indicates they do better.
It does not surprise me one bit. I am married to a very successful woman executive, now retired. And the other thing is studies have shown that, I remember a Catalyst study from years ago that rated different attributes of leadership, and women outpointed men, I think, in every category. So it's not extraordinary.
So based on that, it should indicate that we should have more women in leadership positions. I mean, I think both men and women should be able to lead, but just looking at the disconnect between the performance of female leaders and their access to capital and their percentage of leadership positions, that's a disconnect that I hope the stories and studies in my book will help bridge.
Well, you mentioned a key factor here, and that's access to capital. So is it that women are denied access to places where capital is, or are they dismissed? What is your finding on that, Julia?
Well, it's not about being denied. I don't think gender gaps are in any way a result of malice. I don't think anyone's intending to prevent women from getting to the C-suite. I just think that there are these structures of power in business that move very slowly. And, when you talk about capital, the $330 billion that was invested in the venture capital industry last year, it's venture capitalists are a largely homogenous group. And the fact is that they're largely male, and male investors are less than half as likely to invest in a woman as a female investor is. So I think these things change very slowly.
Right. And what would account for that? It's just that we don't know her. We don't know her. She doesn't. Is that the perception that you have, Julia?
It comes down to this idea of pattern matching. It's human instinct to try to fit people and ideas into patterns you've seen before. So if you're an investor, you might be looking for the next Mark Zuckerberg. You might be looking for someone who reminds you of Mark Zuckerberg. And if you are meeting with a woman who has a very different business model, maybe a different approach to leadership, maybe not talking about changing the world with her social media network or changing the world with her enterprise software network and speaking more practically about what she's already accomplished, that might not fit into a pattern of someone who's going to pay off for you as a successful investment. So I think that people get stuck in these patterns, even if those patterns don't necessarily translate with what actually ends up happening.
Right. Now, you've had an inside look at some of these issues for the past 14 years at least, and that's specifically your role as a reporter for a business publication, Fortune, but also for CNBC. So how did that help shape did that spur you to write this book, or what's the genesis?
So absolutely. Julia? So I was a reporter and writer at Fortune magazine for 6 years. And since then, I've been at CNBC for 16 years. So I've had a long career as a business journalist and a very long career as a TV business journalist. And in those 22 years, I was lucky to get to interview literally thousands of CEOs, leaders, executives. And the vast majority of them were men. The vast majority were white men, because that's who tends to hold those roles. But in the past 5 to 7 years, I started to notice more women in leadership roles, not necessarily just CEOs, also some COOs. And I noticed that those women were approaching problem solving, approaching strategy in different ways than their male counterparts. And I also saw that they had defied incredible odds. I mentioned some of those stats about how little access to capital and how few of those roles are held by women. So I saw that those women had defied the odds. And I figured if I could dig into their stories and understand how they had managed to succeed despite so many challenges, then they would have leadership lessons for everyone.
Great. Let me ask you a sidebar question, because it's top of mind. My last interview was with Carol Hutchins, who recently retired as the softball coach at University of Michigan, the winningest NCAA coach in women's softball. And she is I think she called herself, a child of Title IX, because throughout her career, she grew up when it was available. And I told her that I had many women executives that I have worked with had a background either in high school or collegiate sports. Have you come across that at all, Julia?
Yes, I thought this research was so interesting. I wanted to understand how and to write about in When Women Lead, how successful women defied the odds and what everyone of any gender can learn from them. And there's a lot of really interesting data that shows how people who have done athletics in high school and college tend to be more successful in business. That's true for men and women, but even more so for women. Women who have done sports seriously tend to outperform in the business world. So I was really curious why that was. I was particularly curious because I did not do sports in high school and college. And I wanted to understand, since I can't get in a time machine and go back and have played high school basketball or volleyball, to try to understand what is it about that athletic experience that enables people to be successful. And I assumed going into this research that it might be something about competing against other teams and sort of treating your company as a team, and have rival teams. But in fact, it's not that at all. What it is something surprising. Athletes have a couple of advantages. First, they fail frequently. If you're competing as an athlete, you're going to be getting out onto the field and you're going to lose half the games on average, unless you're very, very on a very good team. But you get used to frequent failure. But this is the most essential thing, something that I believe we can all learn from, and something I wrote about in When Women Lead. Athletes are trained in self-competition. It's not just about competing against another team. It's not just about working as a team. It's about pushing yourself to compete on your own track, understanding here's how I did in this game, here's how I failed, here's what I need to work on to improve. So what psychologists and social scientists call this is after event reviews. One of the women I interviewed and talk about in When Women Lead, she talks about how she doesn't call them postmortems. Whenever there's a pitch meeting or something that they have to review, they don't call them postmortems because nobody died. And they want to create an environment where people are getting really used to evaluating their successes and failures, really used to evaluating their performance. So they do these frequent after event reviews. And here's what's so great about training as an athlete, something which we can all embrace to improve ourselves. This idea that after every experience, every failure, every success, don't rush on to the next thing. Take a minute and go back and see, what did I do really well? What is my strength? What should I feel really proud of and figure out how to get even better at? What did I do really poorly? What is my weakness, and how can I compensate for that in one way or another? And then also, what are the things that were outside of my control? how did I mess up because of these factors that were entirely outside of my control? But at least I need to acknowledge what those things are to understand how to better work with those forces, even if they're outside my control. So that is what the advantage is of being an athlete. And I think we can all learn from that. And there are so many women who are athletes who I write about in When Women Lead, or did other very serious endeavors, whether playing violin very seriously or doing dance very seriously when they were young. And I think it all comes down to those traits of, of being competitive against yourself, charting your own path for success, and also having these frequent after event reviews and getting used to failure.
Yeah, I love the idea of the after, well, the military calls it after action reviews.
Exactly.
And so that's a wonderful analogy. And applying it to oneself is very powerful. And you know what I would say, and maybe it takes guts to look at one's own performance, I think, because we have an ego. So what was your perspective on that, Julia?
Well, one thing that all the women I interviewed have in common is just enough humility to understand that they all need to keep on improving. There's been a lot of work in the business world about the importance of a growth mindset, this idea that you can keep on growing. But in interviewing over 120 women, what I saw is that every woman I interviewed had a growth mindset, in that these women had the balance of humility and confidence. Humility to understand that they didn't know everything. They could keep on getting better. They could keep on improving, whether it was in terms of the product they were creating or the service they were creating or in their own management, but also the confidence to know that they could keep on improving and that they did have something that was strong and unique that they could leverage to their advantage. So I think that's the key thing about the growth mindset, is the balance of humility and confidence, and not having overconfidence, because there's a lot of research showing that men are more likely to be overly confident, especially in times of crisis, and are more likely then to make risky decisions. And that's especially the time when you want to have the humility to learn from those around you.
That's a very powerful thing. And I think you said one of your key takeaways of the book is the fact of so many women have a sense of humility. Now, let me flip that around, because I've had many colleagues and work and women colleagues that a woman's sense of humility, albeit admirable, can hinder her progress at a firm. Have you found that, Julia?
Well, I would use a different term other than humility. I think humility is always a positive thing. I think imposter syndrome is what can be dangerous. And imposter syndrome is this idea that maybe you're not worthy of the position that you've earned, or not worthy of being there. But that is something that women do need to overcome. I was surprised and struck by the fact that so many amazing women who are CEOs who I interviewed for When Women Lead didn't think of themselves as CEOs. They fell prey to pattern matching, this idea that they thought that CEOs were supposed to look like Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg and not someone like them. And so people can apply pattern matching to themselves as well. So imposter syndrome is something to be overcome. And there's a lot of research finding that women are more likely to underestimate their performance or underestimate their strengths. There's an interesting study I cite that shows that they surveyed a bunch of employees, both male and female, and asked them to rate the performance of their CEOs, both male and female. The employees said that the female bosses, the female CEOs, were performing better as CEOs than those CEOs rated themselves. When it came to the male CEOs, they gave the CEOs lower marks than those male CEOs gave themselves. So there is a disconnect in terms of self-perception. But when it comes to ambition and confidence, those are non-gendered traits. So men and women have the same amount of ambition, the same amount of confidence. It's just about how those things are perceived, and how much women feel enabled and empowered to demonstrate their confidence.
That's fascinating, because when it comes to ambition or confidence, I'm glad to know that it's not gender specific, of course, but it's gender perceptive. And I think our culture in many ways does a pretty good job of holding women back. And that becomes a self-perpetuating with so many women. And that's why the fact that there are more and more women leaders who are visible, and young women see that, it opens the door.
And that's why I wrote this book. I wanted my book to demonstrate the range and variety of amazing, inspiring stories. There are so many phenomenal role models in my book and the dozens of women I profile, and they look and sound nothing like an archetypal male leader. And I think what's also essential is to understand that not not only do leaders look very different, but also they lead in very different ways. And we don't need to be leading all in the old GE, Jeff Immelt model of top-down hierarchical leadership. There is a new model of leadership that's emerging, and women are at the forefront of that.
Well, tell us about this new model, because I have this idea that when I would give a keynote or something and people would say, what's new in leadership? I would always flippantly say, nothing, because we've been doing it for millennia. However, things change. So what did you discover, Julia, in your book, When Women Lead?
Well, I reported my book during the pandemic, and I went into the pandemic with this book project, and I knew I wanted to profile these exceptional women leaders. But when the pandemic struck, it was the ultimate test of business that we have seen since World War II. We have never seen such a dramatic test of business leadership. So it was a really fascinating time to examine the strategies and skills of these female leaders. And I interviewed about 120 for the book, which I think I mentioned. So what I discovered over the course of the pandemic, and now here we are coming out of it, is that I really believe that the pandemic shed light and illustrated the importance of some of the traits that female leaders have always had. And I'll run through some of them, but I think now is a time to pay attention to different skills and strategies we need to engage with a remote workforce, to deal with frustrated, burnt out employees who are quiet quitting or part of the Great Resignation, to hold on to those female employees that are considering leaving the workplace because they may feel underappreciated or feel like they have too many responsibilities at home. So I actually think, and I have to say this before I talk about these skills and strategies, now is the moment for everyone, male and female, to leverage some of these traits, because we are in a moment of change in the business world. So some of these skills that women are more likely to lead with. Women are more likely to lead with empathy. It's something that both men and women can deploy. And I would say empathy is not about being nice. Empathy is about understanding where your counterparty, where other people are coming from. So this is an incredibly valuable skill for negotiating with other companies, for negotiating with investors, for understanding what your employees need to feel motivated. So I really feel like the word empathy has sometimes been conflated with kindness, and it's very different. It's more about putting yourself in someone else's shoes so you can understand their perspective. So empathy is key.
Yeah, go on, please.
No, please go ahead.
No, I was going to say empathy. And I always say from a leadership standpoint, but I'm glad how you talked about empathy in relation to potential partners or investors, whatever. That's a different form, but it's a great idea. But from a leadership, I think empathy is the first step, because when an organization is in trouble or individual is struggling, the next step of empathy is to put it in action, which is compassion.
Yeah, but I think empathy, has sometimes conflated with kindness, but I think those two things are different. Empathy can lead to compassion, and empathy is essential to understand how to lead people, right? You need to understand where they're coming from. Another key one that kind of segues from empathy is vulnerability. Vulnerability is admitting what you don't know, and that invites collaboration. And vulnerability is essential to elevate the potential of the people you're working with. One of the CEOs said to me, no one wants to work for a know-it-all. And I think it's really true. If leaders acknowledge what their weaknesses are, then other people will step up to fill in those holes and feel empowered to see opportunity to lead themselves in different ways. So vulnerability is key.
I'm glad you talked about vulnerability, and that's something it's typically not taught in business school, but maybe today it is. But the sense of vulnerability, is it harder for women to not be vulnerable, but show vulnerability for the sense of being perceived as not up to the job? What is your experience in that, Julia?
Women actually feel more comfortable demonstrating vulnerability, but there is this fear of admitting weakness and not wanting to seem weak. But one thing that's interesting is the strongest leaders, those are the ones who are comfortable admitting vulnerability, because they can say, I'm really good at this one thing. This is my strength. I have all of these other things under control, but here is an area where I have weakness. Or we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Things are changing. I don't know how this is going to turn out. I don't know what the right decision is right now, but I want you to come help me and help figure out the right decision. So I think having the confidence and the strength to show what you are good at, what your areas of expertise are, enables you to then admit things that you don't know and that you need to learn. And there's some really interesting research about the importance of turning down your confidence levels. And then when you're trying to make decisions or navigate something totally unforeseen or totally foreign, the importance of turning down your confidence so you can gather the perspectives from the people around you and use that moment of humility and vulnerability to actually learn and to be stronger for it.
I like that idea of turning down one's confidence as a means of essentially growth, I would say, or being open to various points of view. Did you come across any insights into how to tone it down, or is it what would you say, Julia?
Well, I think it was really interesting looking at the navigation of the pandemic in uncertain times. The CEOs who were most successful are those who did not try to make decisions alone in their office or alone in their homes, but those that went down to the people on the ground, closest to the situation, or really relied on data. I think about Karen Seidman Becker. She's the CEO of a biometrics company called Clear. You may have seen their kiosks when you're navigating the airport. She didn't try to make decisions based on her gut or based on her instinct or based on plans she'd already made. She looked at the numbers. What is happening with travel? What are the travel trends? How can I use this data about travel to look around corners? And so she used data rather than her own instinct or intuition to make these decisions. And she was not relying on her own confidence. She was relying on the numbers. And that ended up really working out for them. They ended up slashing the advertising spend for Clear for the entire year of 2020 in February, about a month before a pandemic was declared. And it was clear that things were shutting down. Then she also used data in December of that year to ramp up hiring again to make sure they'd be ready for a rebound in travel in 2021. So it wasn't about her, it was about the numbers. And then I look at the CEOs of massive nonprofits such as Feeding America and Care International. They didn't make the decisions themselves. They relied on what was happening on the ground. They did frequent surveys to get the pulse of what the people on the ground needed to use that to make the decisions. So it wasn't about their own confidence, their own intuition. It was about let me assume that I don't know everything and let me figure out what I actually need to learn.
Great insight. I just call that being business savvy and smart. That's good. So there's something else we often, when we talk about women in leadership, there's the concept of networking. And you came across an interesting outcome of networking when it was not merely connection, but something else. And what was that, Julia?
Well, I think you might be referencing the fact that small networks of women can help overcome the negative impact of bias. Is that what you're referencing? So,
well, that, yes, but also it's something I had never associated with, resilience. How do networks help women with resilience, or any of this?
Yes, resilience is obviously essential for success in business. Everyone's going to go through tough times, but there's some interesting findings that people who have a network, people who they can call upon, not a massive network, you don't need to know everybody, but to have a small, tight-knit and diverse network of people to draw upon when times get tough, those people end up being more successful. And there's some really interesting research, not only about using your network to navigate unforeseen times, but also having the confidence to know you're going to be able to draw on their input, but also to navigate some negative impacts of bias. And unfortunately, there are plenty of negative impacts of bias. If you tell someone that people like them are not going to be good at something, their performance will decline. But if you surround, and there are plenty of instances where women are told, oh, women aren't good at engineering or math, or you're one of the only one in this field, it's going to be hard to do this. And in fact, there's other research showing that the more rare someone is in a role, the more rare a group of people is in a role, a group of people are in a role, the more they're going to be assumed to not be good at that thing. But here's the thing, if you put together a group of female engineers and tell them that women are bad at math and engineering, that stereotype will not have any impact on their performance because they're surrounded with other people like that.
Right. So then the network does reinforce and overcomes the bias, or is a buttress against the bias, which afflicts all of us at any different. But the concept of resilience too, and part of that I think is there's strength in numbers. Hey, she did it, and she did it, and I can learn from her. And so
back to the pattern matching, it's creating a new pattern for you to understand. I'm a part of this pattern. I don't need to fit into that pattern. It's okay that I don't fit into that pattern because I'm part of this new pattern.
Given the fact that women are a minority, way a minority in very senior leaderships and also in startups, Is there a role for women as disruptors because they're already outside the circle? Did you find that, Julia?
Yes, I write about this in When Women Lead. I have a couple of chapters that address this. One is the idea that when you are an outsider, you do have an advantage. It's tough to feel like an outsider. You feel like you're not part of the club, but you may have better perspective on what's actually going on. And I write in the book about some amazing female leaders, including Whitney Wolfe Herd, the CEO and founder of Bumble, Sally Krawcheck, who was at one point the most powerful woman on Wall Street, now has created a financial services company for women. These are women who had experience and expertise in their fields. Whitney Wolfe Herd was on the founding team of Tinder. But then when they were expelled or sort of rejected and ejected from their companies, they said, hey, I have perspective on this industry. I know the industry, so I was an insider well enough to know it. But as a woman, I was always an outsider, and I could use my outsider perspective to reform it, to make it better, to make it serve people like me. So I think for every bit that being an outsider stings, there are some advantages to use that to have a fresh perspective on fixing industries, on disrupting industries to make them work for you and people like you.
Now, great. When women lead, there is another facet to that, which is what can we men learn from when women lead? So,
and the reality is I wrote When Women Lead to be inspiring to women, but to be helpful for men. I think that men need to be liberated to lead in their own ways as well. They shouldn't have to feel like they have to fit themselves into a box of that old, as we said, that old sort of Jeff Immelt GE way of leading. Everyone has their own strengths, and those all can be turned into leadership superpowers, no matter what gender you are. And I think that these ways in which women have been leading, whether it's empathy or vulnerability or gratitude or a focus on purpose along with profits, these are things that are incredibly valuable strategies for men. Men can figure out how to take a page from these exceptional women who have defied the odds, learn from their successes, and apply some of those strategies for your own business success. None of the things I write about have anything to do with biology. They're all strategies that have been sort of socialized to be what women are more likely to do. But there are plenty of examples of how when men lead with these strategies, they're more successful as well. And one I'll just point out is Howard Schultz, the legendary founder and former CEO of Starbucks. He leads with a strategy called servant leadership, which is something women are more likely to deploy. And I write about a number of women who lead with servant leadership. And I can explain a little bit about what that's about. That's in When Women Lead. But Howard Schultz led with this strategy. And even though women are more likely to take that approach, men should be trying to learn from them as well.
Well, servant leadership is actually the bedrock form of school that I work in, and virtually everybody I know is. And so, it's so important. And I hadn't thought of it as gender, but how true it is when women can, that sense of service is women. It comes more naturally to women, perhaps because they're acclimated to it. Whereas boys are not. So,
but by the way, you study it, and other men should as well. And there's some great examples of servant leadership in the book.
Julia, we are racing through this program, and we could go for another hour or so, but time is limited. And as you know, I ask every guest a story about grace, and you've touched on empathy and gratitude and connections and stuff. Is there something else you can add about what grace means to you or how you've observed it in your studies and interviews?
I think there are different versions of grace, and I've seen grace under pressure. Grace under pressure is something that I have to demonstrate every day as a television reporter doing live TV and breaking news, but also grace under the pressure of the performance and the challenges of being successful in business. And one thing I've seen is that pressure, and whether it's the constraints of not having access to capital or the challenges of disrupting a new industry, I really have seen turn coal into diamonds. And I think that so many of the women I've written about have faced so many constraints, so many challenges, but that has forced an ingenuity. That has forced a scrappiness that has ended up serving them and their companies in good stead over time. And I think about one female CEO I interviewed, and she was talking about how she has had less access to capital than her male counterparts. And she said, look, I haven't had the privilege to lose $1 billion every quarter. But as a result, I have been more focused on profitability, and I think my company is stronger for it. So that is someone who's faced financial pressures, financial constraints, and that turned the coal of that negative situation into the diamonds of the advantages that come from that.
That's powerful. And you certainly hit the theme of this show, keeping it together when times are tough. And I love your twist to innovation. So, Julia, we're finished. How can people find you and the book, When Women Lead? So
you can find me on Instagram at Julia Boorstin, on Twitter at jboorstin, and I have a website, juliaboorstin.com, or you can search for When Women Lead and my name. It's on Amazon. It's at all your local bookstores. Please go check out When Women Lead, and I hope you find it as interesting as I found this conversation.
Great. Julia, it has been an honor to interview you, and thank you very much for sharing your time with us.